Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of the Open Source in Business Speaker Series. The topic for today is the delicate art of open source product management. And with me to talk about that topic, we have Adam Jacob, founder and former CTO of Chef and the CEO of the System Initiative, and Scott McCarty, product manager at Red Hat on the OpenShift product. And I'm going to get us started straight away with a question about this idea of product management in open source. The challenge you have, I guess, is figuring out how much work you should be doing when you're building a product on top of an open source project. How much of your work should be with that community project, and how much of your work is based on creating a product. Scott, do you want to start on that topic a little bit?
Yeah. So I always launch with my pitch of I try to view open source as a supply chain for products, just like I would view any technology supply chain, whether you're building airplanes or cars or anything else. And so you start to ask yourself, how much work do you do upstream in a supplier community, right? If you're buying bolts or aluminum or whatever, materials it takes, whatever technology. If you're at Tesla and you're buying KUKA robots to develop the cars, because everybody has suppliers of some kind, even if it's the means of production. How much would a product manager focus on that in any other company is kind of how I compare it, right? And so there are certain things you care about, right? Like I don't necessarily care about how they do things as much as, of course I'm a technical person, and that's actually a danger for many product managers, is if you're too technical, you'll try to get into the how, but you should really think more of why they're doing what, and maybe a little bit of what they're doing and try to influence that just like you would influence any other supplier. So for example, people ask, well, should I be going to DevCon, for example, people at Red Hat? And the answer, product managers in particular, and you're like, well, it depends. Is System D or Podman or any of these other low-level projects in the supply chain for the product that you're building? For me, that happens to be true. So it's an absolute yes, right? It's the same thing as if I was an auto manufacturing and Bosch had a fuel injector conference and I was the product manager of, powertrain systems or whatever. Of course, I would go to the Bosch conference and try to influence Bosch on whatever features they're going to add for my, I would try to influence what I want for my product.
So how do you separate the building a great project from building a great product? There's got to be some balance there. Adam, how did you handle that balance in your former experience?
Yeah, I think you have to draw the delineation between what we usually call the project. So you can think about it as the software is a reasonable thing. And then you can think of the product, which is a superset of the software. So there's the software, but there's also how you interact with your supply chain. There's how you assemble it. There's how you sell it. There's how you support it. There's how you document it. There's how you ship it. Is it a SaaS? On and on and on. There's all these different angles to the product part of the work. So when you're doing product management, you're thinking about who are the potential users of your product. You're thinking about who are the potential buyers? What's the differentiation between a buyer and a user, right? Some people will pay and some people won't. Who buys? Why do they buy? What are their pains? You're thinking about those angles, and then you're constructing a system by which you recognize who those people are when you see them, and then prosecute them, which is a terrible word, but it's the word we use, as a lead, sort of through this funnel down to the bottom where they turn into money. And I think when you're so thinking about where do you spend your time and sort of how do you get that thing right? No successful project has no product management. So even the software itself without any commercial product has some angle about why they think someone should use it, why they think it's good, that stuff exists. As a product owner, I think your job is really to spend most of your time on those angles, more than it is on the software. Not that you're not spending time paying attention to software, you are, but it's half your time. And the other half is how are they going to discover it? And how are we going to know about it? And how are those things going to happen? And I think there's not a whole lot of difference between doing that for an open source product and just doing it for a product at all. Like, Scott's fuel injector example is a good one. Like, yes, it's different because they're talking about fuel injectors and you're talking about software products, but it's not that different. Like, you're still thinking about like, well, like if I'm the fuel injector manufacturer, I'm looking for people who need fuel injectors. So who's my target market? And what's special about my fuel injector? Well, I made it out of titanium tungsten carbide, and so it can fuel inject at 3 times the rate, whatever. And it's kind of the same. And I think that's just where you should spend your time if you're a good product owner.
But in the case where you're building a product on open source, you may end up with a car where everybody has an identical fuel injector, and at that point, fuel injector is no longer a differentiation. Are you ever worried about somebody putting together a car from all of the component parts and competing with your product without providing any support? Putting together an open source product, for want of a better word, a free project that does the same amalgam as you do in your product?
I mean, I'm not. I don't know, but people certainly are. I think the way to think about it is, to me, when you decide that you're an open source product, what you're saying is one of your primary channels for targeting customers is the open source channel. So every person who uses the open source software that you use to build your product, every single one of those people is a possible customer of your product, right? And so that funnel gets big, and it gets big without you, which is what makes it magical. So in most proprietary software businesses, you have to manage the top of the funnel and you manage the bottom. So you have to go dig for customers, right? You have to pop them out, and then you have to try to get them to become customers. If you have a functioning open source project, that flywheel happens on its own. Like, users talk to each other. They go use the open source software. There's this set of people who start that motion, and they do it without you, and they do it without they don't need you at all. Then there's another category of people, usually, who are the people you're going to ask for money from, who they kind of do need you, right? Like that initial flywheel isn't quite enough for them. And so when you think about somebody building and taking your software and trying to build another product to compete with you on it, what they're actually doing is building the top of your funnel, right? Like, they're making the funnel at the top bigger. And since that impact is so outsized, the number of opportunities they create for you is bigger than the amount you lose at the bottom in competition every now and again. So it's not because you're going to win every deal at the bottom. You won't. Some people will just decide to run the open source software. Some people will maybe choose the other product, right? They'll choose SUSE over Red Hat. They'll choose Puppet over Chef, like whatever they're going to do. But in the end, if we share that common upstream or downstream, whichever direction we're going, like the impact we're creating is the top of funnel impact. And because there's more top of funnel impact, there's more availability of money at the bottom, which means the pie gets bigger for everyone, which is why this works. That's why you see like MongoDB, for all the like shouting about how the cloud companies are going to kill their revenue. Every time a cloud provider launches a new service, MongoDB stock price goes up, not down. Because their revenue goes up, not down. Why is that? Well, it turns out that the more MongoDB there is in the world, the more shots on goal MongoDB gets to be the vendor who sells you MongoDB. And it turns out that they're really good at being MongoDB. And so Amazon is getting some revenue off their MongoDB service. Great. But what they're really doing is getting people using MongoDB. And every single one of those AWS MongoDB people, when they hit some wall at AWS, they call MongoDB and they go, man, I can't get the AWS guys to say anything to me. I got this query optimization problem. I don't even know. And MongoDB goes, well, do I have a product for you? Check out this Atlas thing. Here's the guy that wrote the query optimizer. Would you like to pay us instead of Amazon? And you're like, sure. Next thing you know, you switched. That's the top of the funnel thing in action, right? There's more value at the top of the funnel than there is that you gain more value by making the top bigger than you do by excluding getting fewer shots on goal, but more win percentage. Analogy got away from me.
So that's the kind of the primary benefit of building a product on open source is you optimize the adoption of the project. But I've seen a number of cases where product owners make some decisions about the project that actually affect the adoption of the project. They make it a little bit harder to use because maybe the installer is a differentiation. They make it it's not so well integrated because maybe the integration with other components is the differentiation in your product. How do you balance those things? Scott, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah. So I was thinking about that. I agree the top of the funnel is important, and that is definitely a bonus of open source, but I try to look at it as you would never try to, again, going back to our fuel injector example, like Bosch, and GM. So GM never tries to make it harder for Bosch, right? Like that's not a natural thing they would ever do. Or let's go with Spirko seats, which are famous in tuner communities. They're you'll see them in the Fast and the Furious movie, right? Like everybody has Spirko seats. The Honda and Toyota and GM and any other car that you have these seats in doesn't make it harder for the supplier, right? That's not a natural interaction between a healthy, consumer vendor, somebody that's selling a vendor product and their supply chain, right? That's an unnatural thing. It's just for some reason in open source, we think through this. And I'll admit, I think I agree with everything Adam said, but I would argue that it depends on the type of product. It depends on how big it gets. So if you look at the revenue of RHEL, our numbers that we reported before we got bought by IBM were fairly large numbers for a single open source product. I think it's the biggest open source product in the world. You can't get to that number by only getting those people that use the technology. You have to go after business problems. And so,
of course.
So it's part of it. It's not all of it. And I think there's a natural balance that happens once a product gets big enough that you start to go after those business problems, and then you just feed the funnel yourself. And that technology user becomes a smaller and smaller component of it.
Yes,
it's just a natural thing that happens. And then that tension goes away. For the most part,
it can. I mean, in open core businesses, it doesn't. So in open core businesses, the tension remains. What flips is that now you're big enough that you feed it like a proprietary software company feeds it, and the plurality of leads start coming from your own lead gen as opposed to coming from the organic groundswell that gets you there. And that's one of the reasons that it doesn't that you see the various possible open source business models and their relationships to their upstreams, to their supply chain. Sometimes it's a single vendor who owns the supply chain. That's kind of how Chef worked. Sometimes it's a conglomeration like OpenShift. But yes, as the business gets bigger, the product management piece of it and the business design piece of it, you get less and less differentiation between a proprietary business and a non-proprietary business as it gets bigger. Because essentially at some point, you're yes, the reason you chose RHEL is because it's RHEL. You didn't choose it because it was Linux and you just happened to wander across it.
And then I make the argument, though, that there's another value to open source. And this is where I argue that, relying on an open source supply chain can be the difference between. So in normal, this is the beauty of software in general combined with open source. These two things together are magical compared to the fuel injector, because the fuel injector costs $5 to manufacture and I just have to pay $7. I have to give Bosch enough money that they can make a profit and stay alive. And we all know, I mean, this is a known thing in business, but suppliers never make as much money as the end product. GM makes $7,500 on a car. Bosch makes, a couple hundred off their fuel injection system or whatever. The suppliers are always a lower margin business. This is why big auto manufacturers spin off their suppliers. So this natural tendency to try to reduce the cost in the supply chain is a natural thing in all products. And so open source actually does this out of the box. Again, as a PM, I look at it as it's a non-profit entity that doesn't have sales and marketing costs, that's still building a great supply chain product for me, essentially, that I don't have to go pay for. And if the way I pay is I dedicate engineers to it. So say I dedicate 3 engineers that cost $100,000 each, I'm dedicating $300,000, but I might be getting back $1 million in product or $5 million. Easy. Yeah. I mean, it's outrageous, the return on investment from open source. It's just so much better than a physical supply chain. So it's a no-brainer in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's absolutely true in the OpenShift model, or most of RHEL's model, where RHEL is the greatest aggregator of open source supply chains into products ever, I think, in the planet. There are other examples, but it's the best one. I think when you look at companies like Chef or HashiCorp or Confluent or any of those things, where they're less an aggregator of a bunch of software, and they're more a distributor of a specific piece of software. I think you do get less of that lift in general, because the ROI on the open source investment is pure top of funnel. because you're doing most of the engineering work. So if it was a proprietary software business, right? Just imagine that HashiCorp was fully proprietary. The thing that would be hard for HashiCorp is convincing you that what you should do is try Terraform, because it's not free. And they could make it free as in $0, but then you'd still be investing. It's that top of the flywheel that they would struggle. Once they got past that top of the flywheel, the delta, now they're $1 billion business, not in revenue, in valuation, but not that anyone who's watching this cares. But you know what I mean? They're a big business, and now that they're a big business, it's self-sustaining. And the delta between if they were a proprietary thing and not, you could probably ask a lot of their customers, I'm sure they'd all say that they would prefer it was open source. But if you got them for real and really cornered them, I bet a significant number of their customers would buy it if it was proprietary, right? Because they don't actually care. They're consuming the product as if it's proprietary already.
Yeah, and I'll add, Adam, like if you look at OpenShift 2.0, which I sold because I was a solution architect, it was it was essentially a single vendor upstream project, if you will. And as soon as we saw Kubernetes, we started talking to Google, we jumped on that because it was a no-brainer, right? If Google's going to spend half the money investing in this and we're going to spend half the money, now we get 2 for $1 for every money, every dollar we spend. That was the beauty of choosing the supply chain. You could tell we did a supply chain. We went up, we're not buying fuel injectors from Bosch anymore. We're going to go to some company you've never heard of called Kubernetes. And, and
it was a much better idea. It was way better, right? Yeah. Way better. Because you knew what product you were selling. The product you were selling was the final experience where an enterprise user has an application to deploy that's like a traditional enterprise application, and they want to make it easier to run and manage and deploy that thing across their whole environment. And that's what OpenShift's promise was. And so it was never that you were the best container engine in the world. That wasn't the promise. No one cares. What they cared was, how do I get my proprietary, my app, the thing my business does, how do I make that be easier to run and manage across its life cycle? And so of course you switch suppliers, right?
So I've got a question here from Paris Lucas. He asks, can you provide examples of good and poor open source projects as supply chain? Are there examples of products that have failed because of choosing the wrong project in their supply chain, as an example?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I could share personal examples. I don't know, Adam, if you want to go first or me.
Oh, no, I kind of want you to go first, but I have some too.
Well, I'll say this as a user back in the day long before I was a product manager, I was a sysadmin. This is 15 years ago. I remember using Sugar CRM and being very frustrated by the way they literally limited what plugins could be in the community. There was a community app store type thing, and they would literally not let the thing that you needed, like an email merge capability. And there was 20 of them that people had written open source to add to the project, the upstream, and they wouldn't let them be in the marketplace. So you couldn't go find them because that was one of the values that they held back that they wanted to sell Sugar CRM for. I'm this is the most unnatural tension I've ever seen. It was the horridness of what happens in the worst case scenario of open core and a single vendor upstream. It was terrible. And I think they failed. I don't know what happened to Sugar CRM.
I mean, failed. It's an interesting, they're still around, and Sugar, I mean, they did good in relative terms. How many businesses get over a couple hundred, get over anywhere close to 100 million in revenue? Very few. So Sugar succeeded in many ways. They weren't a home run for their investors, but Sugar they didn't fail. But I think Sugar's a great example of one that sort of ran that open core play kind of wrong. I think, in choosing a supply chain, I think the most raw example in the near term was Docker themselves, where I'm
glad you brought it up, not me.
I know, I was hoping you were going to bring it up, and then you didn't, and I was God damn it. So that was literally what I was waiting for you to do, because I was then I won't be the one who did it. But I was the one who did it. So, I think everybody loves to armchair quarterback Docker. I was not there. I'm probably wrong. But one way to look at that problem was they saw very clearly that the value was going to be, the customer value was going to be in what the experience was that a user was going to have getting their applications into containers and managing that lifecycle over time. That was clear that was that was where most of the customer value was going to be. That's, it's what OpenShift saw. It's what sort of everybody sees. Like, not that the low level infrastructure isn't valuable, but it's not the thing. And I think they made a bet on their own supply chain and went, actually, we'll be better off. Like, we can build a better end product if we integrate our own supply chain than if we use what would become Kubernetes. I think that bet turned out to be wrong. And I think it was wrong because the dynamics inside the community, the lift in Kubernetes meant that like that top of funnel was so strong that by opting themselves out a little of that stream, there was not enough. Like now, actually, here, let me put it this way. Today, I think you could absolutely launch a business that was the anti-Kubernetes with an integrated supply chain, because Kubernetes is so big that there's a big enough piece of people who have decided it's garbage that they'd be interested in what you're selling. They'd be like, hey, I want to take a look at that alternate Kubernetes supply chain. I kind of hate Kubernetes. And like, they'd be in, and you could probably build a very good business being the anti-Kubernetes right now. But you couldn't do that when Docker made that bet, right? And it wasn't clear. It wasn't an obvious business choice. These are really hard product decisions because internally, like, you do have all the expertise. You do know that it would be faster to put those things together. Kubernetes wasn't stable. Like there's this huge list of all these things that get it wrong. But it's one of those moments where you look at it and you're like, okay, do I trust the lift I'll get with a bigger top of funnel, or do I run more like a proprietary software business and say that the value is in my technology innovation, which I will keep? And they made that choice and they lost. And, they made other choices. I'm sure there were a million other reasons. It's complicated, et cetera. But like, I think that's a really good example of like really just making the wrong supply chain decision. Like, it was a bad supply chain decision from a product point of view. And it's easy to coach the outcome. So, if you're the actual product owner in that actual seat, whoever they were, that was a very hard decision. And I think you probably made the right call at the time. I mean, you made the wrong call in retrospect, but like in that moment, I totally get how you made that call.
Yeah. And I'll add, some of it was, I'll play. I agree with everything you said, but now they were one of my biggest competitors, obviously. Like I was in that battle. So yeah. Like, I know it, at least from the outside, from a competitor that was paying pretty close attention to them. I'll say this, some of it was not their fault. Some of it was, obviously, like some of it was choices it was not. What is really hard for people to understand is that I'm playing my own game and you're playing your own game, and they're two different games a lot of the time. Even though we're both selling, like, this is a perfect example, like Tesla. People always go, oh, Lucid Air is coming up on Tesla. I'm like, no, they're not. Lucid Air is doing a different thing than Tesla. It's an electric car. It's more focused towards the car guy. They're going to have swappable parts and it'll be improvable. It'll essentially be a race car in a lot of ways. Like, it's a very different game than what Tesla's playing. Tesla's going wide, trying to like sell to the masses. They need moms to trust that this thing is safe and put their kids in it with car seats.
Yeah.
Like, it's a very different game. And everyone's like, oh, their technology is going to be better. I'm like, you're paying attention to the wrong thing from a product perspective. This doesn't matter. Like, they can diverge, and they'll both have good businesses in different niches.
Moms don't buy race cars.
Moms don't buy race cars. Same with Docker and Red Hat. Like, to be honest with you, at the container engine level, the problem is they couldn't create a product from that. Obviously, that's not enough by itself to be. That's like the supply. That's like selling a fuel injector. Like, sure, you could sell some fuel injectors to guys that modify their cars, but it's not a big enough business as a car. Like to sell a car. Red Hat already had a car, the operating system. And we were like, we just need this fuel injector. That's pretty cool. We'll use that. Yeah. And it adds value to our car. But they didn't really have a car. So they went, oh, we need a car. And then like, we'll build our own using Swarm, and kind of went, yeah. And then everything you said happened. Like
yes, I think that's right. And it's interesting. So like, one of the things that they decided, that core container engine, like, as a product owner, we shouldn't. I mean, I feel a little bad about talking about Docker. It's so interesting that it's sort of what happens. And like, I just want to say a million times, it's so complicated and I'm probably wrong, but I'm going to riff on it anyway, but it's not because I actually know. I don't. If I had a better example, I would use it. But like, I think when you put yourself in the point of view of that moment where you took that core Docker engine and then like this, it spun into Moby, and then it's sort of spun back, and like there's a lot of things that happened sort of later. And I think the shape of the assets that they have and the shape of the game, like, I think they understood that what they needed was that huge top of funnel lift. Like a huge part of Docker's initial success was that everybody was using Docker. And we were using Docker because it was great. Like everybody who ever typed Docker run something and hit enter, and then it happened, like, man, you'll crawl over broken glass to get that back. We're still crawling over broken glass to get it back, right? Because like anybody who's used Kubernetes, it's not as easy as Docker run blah, blah. And like everything that everybody's doing is trying to get it that easy again. Because it was beautiful. It was glorious. And it was beautiful for a consumer. Like people wanted that experience. And inside the dynamics of open source, knowing that they were going to get that big reach, they got that big reach. But then the question was, well, how do we make sure that we're the ones who get the majority of the pie at the bottom of the funnel? How do we make sure that the most money from the results of what we've done land in our pocket? And I think that was the wrong question. I think there was like that point of view about, well, I started it, therefore I deserve the share, drives the wrong dynamics in open source businesses, because we're back to the top of the funnel again. If they just said, yep, we're the best Docker people in the world, Red Hat can ship Docker all day, they got nothing on us. How many people would, they'd have built a great business. And Red Hat would have let them. Red Hat would have probably been in. Red Hat might have bought them. Who knows? Whatever. We're gesticulating wildly. But conceptually, that's the kind of thing that open source product management really entails. It's looking at that gameplay and going, oh, okay, this is my asset, is that I have this thing that can be self-sustaining, it can go in the world, it can do things I didn't expect, and every person who touches it is instantly in my funnel. And so then it's about, well, what do I do with it? And when we treat it like a proprietary business, what we do is ruin it. And the ways we ruin it are complicated, but it's very fragile. And yeah.
It's actually, you've touched on something which is one of the most difficult issues in building an open source product, is that oftentimes what gets traction is the community brand. That was the case with Chef. That was the case with Docker. And Docker didn't start life as Docker Inc. It started life as .cloud, and Docker was just a project. But then, because Docker became successful, the company changed the name. And at that point, you're in a naming conflict where you have a community brand thing, something that people attach a certain meaning to, except that you've got a company behind it that's affirming the trademark, the company name is involved. And I know that Chef has gone through this as well, is how do you go about, and Red Hat went through it, with Red Hat Linux, the transition from Red Hat Linux to Red Hat Enterprise Linux. How do you manage that? What's the word I'm looking for? Conflation of community brand and company brand, and how do you allow a community project to evolve under a different brand without damaging, what it brought to the table in the first place?
I think that's a great question. I think you, first off, if you're selling a product, you must own the brand. Full stop. 100%. End of story. Mm-hmm. There is no conversation. There's no version of the universe where you sell a product but you don't own the brand. That's insane, and it can't work. So, so that's just, so we just start there. So I'll use Chef as an example. I always owned Chef. In the very beginning, Adam Jacob, owned that software and owned its trademark and owned the thing. And then I started a company called Opscode. Then Opscode owned that trademark. And there was never a community version of Chef where that mark was in the world and didn't come with my largesse. Do you know what I mean? The world got it because I let them have it. But it was never there was a community around Chef, and that community recognized Chef as itself. And I'm not saying it didn't have ownership over the experience or over that thing. Absolutely, we did. And it was thousands of people, and it was one of the greatest things I've ever been part of in my entire life. It was beautiful. It's still beautiful. It's glorious. But that brand belongs to Chef. It always belonged to Chef. And when we were an open core business, we allowed that conflation to happen because we believed that it was better for conversion. that people believed that there was an open source distribution of Chef that you could get for no money was part of the conversion funnel to the paid versions of Chef that I was trying to sell you sort of in the open core model. When we shifted more to the free software product model, more Red Hat's model, all of that went away, but at one exception. Now there wasn't a version of Chef anymore that was distributed free of my terms. So in order to get Chef, you had to pay me for it at some point. Whereas before, I would both make the software and I would give it to you for free, right? And now I make the software, but I don't necessarily give it to you for free. Now there's another open source project that's called Sync. Sync is downstream of Chef, stands for Sync is not Chef. And they produce their own builds. You can go download Sync, right? And they're a delightful group of people. But that's the first time ever in the history of Chef's entire life that somebody who didn't work at Chef Inc. could make a build. And I just want to which the delta there in its community management is just mind-blowingly big, right? And so I would argue it's a much healthier thing now that there are two, because there's actually a reasonable alternative now in a way that there never was before. You were always sort of beholden to me. No, nobody likes it when you were getting something for free and now you can't. So there were people who were mad because they were like, oh man, you used to drop it off at my house and now you don't. And I'm like, well, yeah. But ultimately I think that is the way you need to think about how you manage it, because as a product owner, you must own the brand. If you don't have a product. And once you decide you're going to own the brand, then the question is, under what terms can people interact with it? It's a product. How can they buy it? And it's usually better if it's separate, but I think it doesn't have to be separate, right? What it has to be is yours.
Yeah, I'll add just one real small thing to that, Dave. The simple analogy I use, again, going back to my fuel injector, I was you can make it work. I mean, you can make all of these things work. They're just all tensions, right? Certain things create more tension. But if you have a company named Fuel Injector and you sell fuel injectors, and the downstream company that builds on your fuel injectors sells fuel injectors, that's gonna create problems. You're gonna be like, wait, what is it? It's a company. I'm confused. The thing that you're selling me is a fuel injector, and the project name's fuel injector, and the company name's fuel injector, and the downstream product is also fuel injector. I'm confused now. Of course, people are going to have hurt feelings when then you reswizzle those things and they all kind of thought they were one thing, right? It's obvious.
So I want to change tack a little bit. We got a question in chat earlier. How do you manage the open source components that you use, frameworks, etc., for security, compliance, etc.? And this touches on something we talked about in prep, where there's that XKCD comic that came out recently where he has a product or a solution being a pile of bricks, and there's an arrow pointing to one little brick at the bottom of the pile that's this one project that's been maintained for free for 20 years by a single developer in Nebraska. How do you manage that kind of risk profile across these really complex dependency trees that we have in open source products?
Who do you want to tackle that?
Go, Scott.
So I work in the RHEL. So I know you announced me as an OpenShift product manager. I sort of manage some of the little pieces, parts in the supply chain for OpenShift, but I actually live in the RHEL product, business unit. So this is part of our world, right? We're a Linux distro that's been around a long time and has a lot of these little bricks, if you will. Again, part of and everyone knows this, from the CTO's office at Red Hat to the product managers to we're responsible for the business, but still everybody from engineering to the CTO's office knows that security is a key value proposition of Red Hat, right? We know that's something that if we damage that piece, it will hurt our business. And so we're paying attention to that supply chain. We have to, right? We have to do risk analysis, just like, again, an aircraft manufacturer would do analysis on a supply chain and say, can I get these bolts from China? Let me switch analogies. Everyone knows the recent COVID stuff with the masks, right? Like there was a 3M factory in China said, thank you, that's ours now. We'll take that. And then you can figure out how to make your own masks. That's what happens in times of crisis, right? There's going to be interruptions. these are, network divisions in network, if you look at fault tolerance, right? Like supply chains are just something that you have to make fault tolerant. And so if there's a single point of failure, it's something you better be paying attention to, right? And I think there's both a qualitative and a quantitative component. You can look, are there other things we could change the supply chain to, like we did with Podman and Docker, like we did with, Gears and Kubernetes? You can sometimes change the supply chain. Maybe that's a reasonable thing to do. But then there are these single point of failures like OpenSSL, right? Like, which are just like, it is what it is. Everybody uses it in the whole world. And you better have qualitative, you better start putting more engineers and time and money and eyeballs on that. Like those are part of managing the supply chain. It's supply chain management in a nutshell. You have to make sure your upstream vendors are healthy.
But then how do you even know?
$7 for fuel injectors instead of $5, because if you only pay them $5.05, they're going to go out of business.
Yeah, I was going to say
identify the risk, because you could put people on OpenSSL, but if OpenSSL depends on some C library that's been unmaintained for 20 years, that's a risk, right? So how do you even get an awareness of the depth and breadth of the dependencies that you have? Like we've seen some of those issues with the JavaScript libraries that brought down half the internet, right? It's how do you gain an awareness of the risk profile that you're exposing yourself to as a vendor?
I think there's two aspects. So one is how do you proactively understand your supply chain? And so that's about understanding what the components are in the supply chain and what they provide for you. And you usually don't do that all the way down to like left pad, to use your example of of JavaScript libraries, because it'd be insane. Because on the day that you said like, well, is it dangerous to have a dependency on left pad? Like, what would your analysis be? The answer is no. No, it's not dangerous. It's like 8 lines long. It pads a string to the left. It's really not, like, it's fine if you want to have that as a dependency. Do you need it as a dependency? I mean, no, but who cares? Like, no reasonable person would look at it and be like, oh, that is a risk in my supply chain. Now, what happens instead is the left pad bad day happens, something shenanigans. So then all of a sudden, your supply chain breaks because of left pad. Now the question is, how quickly can you react to the disruption in your supply chain? Because that's actually what managing supply chains is more about. Yes, there is a process, there is a proactive part that's vetting, like, should we take this dependency or not? Is it the right thing? Is it Podman or Docker? But then there's also just oh no, there's something wrong in my supply chain. How quickly can we turn around the fix? How quickly can we repair what's broken and get it out to the world? And that's really where you need to focus. It's less on, not that you don't focus on prevention, of course you do, but like you can't prevent it because the supply chain's so big and you're not. And like, that's just the nature of the universe. Like, I don't know what all the different pieces are in the true supply chain for my software. Like, there's so many. What I do know is how quickly I could turn around a fix. And that's where the customer product interaction comes in, that says, look, it's part of the value prop here that I'm giving you by certifying that supply chain is that I'm the one who will react to it, and I'll react better than you, and I'll react faster, and I will get it in your hands, and I will solve that problem for you right now.
Yep. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about upstream contributions. I think personally, like it should not be a bragging thing. Like, oh, we have 22% of these, it's not that. It's just, you need to express to the customer that you have enough involvement in the supply chain. Again, you're buying enough from Bosch that Bosch will fix the fuel injector when it's broken, right? But this is I have enough engineers and QE people and docs people and all kinds of people participating in this upstream community, and they have enough expertise that they'll be able to react to a broken supply chain quick enough,
Yes, or just a bug, like one of my favorite Red Hat stories of all time, not to turn it into a Red Hat festival, but personal. Like, I had this Oracle cluster that was failing all the time, rack cluster back in the day. And it was because there was this query we were running that was smaller than the size of a kernel task struct. And the memory would get fragmented, and then eventually the kernel couldn't allocate a task struct anymore, and the server would reboot because it was like, oh, can't even. And then eventually it did that, and it corrupted the on-disk file system for Oracle. And no one could figure out how to fix this problem. The Red Hat person could tell me what the problem was eventually. Eventually they were like, I think the problem was this task struct is too, like, you run out of this. And then we had to hire this expensive dude who could do the matrix dance and read the raw file system. But both of those existed because there were vendors who knew that those people were real and could make them happen. Red Hat put a dude on a plane, sat next to me. The dude who could crack open the raw file system and read it in hex, and then see the line that was wrong and be like, oh, that's wrong. And I'm like, what's wrong? He's like, see that little hex there? That's wrong. And then he typed in the fix. He just was like, boop, 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 boop. And I was like, whoa, what are you doing? And he was like, open it now. And everything was cool. And I was like, that is the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life. And like, but that is the product. That's the product.
That's the product.
And you know, it's not because that can devolve into saying the product is support. It's not support. Like, yes, in that instance, it's the support that I got, but it's the whole thing. It's the fact that exists, that those people are there. It's that you have that 20% of the engineers who you can influence that roadmap, who could fix that Kubernetes bug, even if the other people in Kubernetes don't care. Red Hat cares, and that's all that matters.
So as a practical matter, I mean, both of you have been involved in building successful products on open source. As a practical matter, how much effort does like security analysis take on your dependencies? Like, how many engineers? How much of it is automated, and how much of it is kind of just a lot of man hours?
For Chef, it was mostly automated because it's one product with a known list of dependencies. We weren't integrating. It wasn't RHEL, where it's like thousands of upstreams. I imagine RHEL is mostly automated too, but yeah, it was mostly automated, and it was mostly about reacting because we weren't proactively doing a lot of those things. Sometimes we were, but it was rare that we were the ones who found the problem. Do you know what I mean? It was more common that somebody else found it, and our job was to react.
Yeah, I'd say for us, it's 3 big buckets. One bucket is definitely automated. I mean, it's upstream automated and downstream automated because we do additional testing even downstream, as we're building our distro, obviously. That's a huge chunk. That's probably about a third. Another third is going out and like all kinds of weird things, like, interactions with other teams. So like, I'll give you an example was like Golang. So like Derek Parker is a core Golang contributor, at Red Hat. So my team interacts with them because Podman's written in Golang, right? And we were trying to do FIPS compliance, for example. And so you're trying to nail this really strange, hard requirement because this is a binary that is compiled by a Golang compiler. And you're like, the SSL library in Golang is not FIPS certifiable. So Derek's like, I have a good idea. I can just link it against OpenSSL, and we already paid to certify OpenSSL, and so we can now link these binaries against these LD .SOs basically that are already certified. This will work. And I'm like, okay, that's pretty cool. I would have never came up with that. Like, Derek is the smart enough person to come up with this. And then my team's like, all right, we'll use that. And then but that's like a lot of interaction, figuring out all that crazy complexity, and then figuring out what you're going to do. It's like, building the solution from scratch that nobody's ever figured out or even thought about figuring out. Like, it's insanity, but it's cool. That's probably a very fun part of my job. There's a third of that. Yeah. And then another third is like keeping our eye out and like paying attention. Like, IBM team is like, we have some crazy open source, blah, blah, blah. Do you want to come take a look at this? So it's like keeping your eye out for like this new stuff. And then like, I hate to say it, doing a sniff test on it and being like, I'll send emails to my team as the PM. Hey, what do you guys think about this project? They're like, what is this? And they're like every now and then I notice something they don't notice, and like they go and do the due diligence, or they'll immediately be like, that's stupid. That's never going to work. Blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, we won't pay attention to that.
Yeah.
So a third of it is like probably paying attention to external new stuff and making sure you're integrating the right things. Some of it's probably building these new things that like are just weird and crazy. And then a third of it is just automated, making sure we do not regress, at all, like if possible, ever.
Scott, that was solid gold.
So I'd like to leave some time at the end here for questions from the audience. So I've got a few questions here from Paris Lucas in the Q&A. Paris, are you interested in joining us on screen here and asking your questions yourself or making your contribution yourself? Rejected. Re-invite. Rejected. I guess not. It's so anybody else who's in attendance. You don't have a mic connected. Okay. Anybody else who's in attendance? Do you have anything that you'd like to add to this conversation? An opinion that you have, or a question that you'd like to ask our panel? Now is the time.
Clearly, we nailed it.
Awkward silence.
I mean, some of Paris's questions that he wrote in the chat, I think, thinking about how like licensing and project framework, like how do you sort of think those things through? I think licensing should be licensing from a product management point of view is about deciding where the value comes. So like if it's Kubernetes, for example, then what you want is the license to be as open as possible, because the goal of the project is to get as wide the adoption as possible, and downstream monetization is someone else's problem, right? I'm commoditizing the Kubernetes thing. That's my business. My business value for Google, for example, was that they were going to commoditize Kubernetes, which then becomes the dominant API. And then the bet they make is that they're the best Kubernetes vendor in the world, right? So like, I think so the right license choice for them is whatever the most liberal one they could get was, Another alternate example would be like the Linux kernel, where it's also a free software island, but it makes a very specific licensing choice that says everybody who plays in this free software island must contribute back to the free software island by using the GPL. And that's one of the reasons that Linux hasn't bifurcated in the ways that other things have, because it's pretty hard to take Linux and build a proprietary kernel around it, because it kind of doesn't let you. And if you imagine the Linux kernel only MIT license, the answer would be massive fracturing. Like, there's no question that there would have been a bunch of vendors who would have taken it and added a bunch of proprietary junk into it, and you'd have like 100 different proprietary Linuxes. And so like that choice of license and of the model, I think they go together. And so it's more about choosing which one enables the type of open source business channel that you're going to construct. Most of the time, I think the answer there tends toward liberal licenses. It tends toward Apache. It tends toward MIT. Not always, because again, it just depends on the product, and it depends on what the outcome is that you're hoping to achieve.
So I'll have Paris put this on the screen.
I just want to add like a 10-second, Dave, if you don't mind. The one thing, and you were more in this than me ever, Adam, but like in startups, I think there's this new trend of questioning, like maybe not GPL, maybe not MIT or Apache, maybe we'll just come up with some new thing that's kind of proprietary. And you're like, obviously for us, that's not a possibility. But it is interesting in that the immediate reaction I have to that, whenever they go, well, we'll just add a little proprietariness to this license. Yeah. I'm like, licensing never creates new value. Like actually creating technology creates value. Like the licensing does not create new value for your customer. And honestly, my opinion is it's a distraction for PM to even think they can like tweak those. Like I know as a PM, I cannot tweak those knobs. I go to turn that knob and it just doesn't work at Red Hat. So I have to go find other value. Like I have no choice but to go find other value.
I gave a whole talk at OSCON, like a whole keynote about how I think that's busted, because it's busted. Yeah. Like when you make that choice, you're fundamentally misunderstanding the open source supply chain, and you're and it's a huge distraction. The thing is that most of the people who are doing it already have pretty good businesses. And so they're convinced that the reason their business is pretty good is because they made those shenanigansy choices. What that tells you is most people give a hoot about the license. Look at how I constrain myself. The word that should have come out used an F. But they don't care.
So we're joined on screen by Paris Lucas.
But there are people who miss out those people.
Sorry, we lost your audio a little bit there, Adam, at the end. But we're joined on screen by Paris Lucas, who has a question or a contribution. I'm not sure how exactly you'd frame it, Paris.
Well, it's just a couple of set of questions. I didn't know which ones were appropriate for this conversation, so I just put them out there, see which ones made sense to talk about. But our biggest challenge, I think, in open source community right now is a lot of people are jumping in, but they don't really understand what the culture is. And that's why the previous comment that you just talked about with putting a little thing about licensing. Here at Red Hat, we have that challenge only because, we grew from 2,000 people to over 15,000 in a very short period of time. And everybody that comes into the company, comes in with their own view of the world and everything. And what they haven't done was taken the time to actually sit down and say, what is the open source way? What is it really about? And then you can drive your business based on the value that you're contributing to the community. That's where the value is. The licensing and everything is just to show who created it, give them street cred, let them know that they did add value to the solution. But the whole goal of it is what can you add as additional value to it, not so much how much you can exploit somebody else's value. Well, and that's just my thing. But my real question is around this. How do we, or how have you, or how do you see us bringing more people in to understand that it's about contributing, it's not about taking. It's about giving, it's not about taking. And that's always been, I'm just saying, for your small projects that you have worked on, what has worked and what has not worked. Because one of the challenges I have as somebody that's skilled in one area and not in another is the math problem, which I always hated. The math problem is when you ask somebody to help you with a little math problem, and they felt because it was hard for them, it should be hard for you. And that's not the solution. The solution is figuring out how the person really learns and help them to master it, not make things hard. And a lot of times that's what we're experiencing. Well, because it took me 5 months to learn it, I'm going to have to make you spend 5 months to learn it. And I feel a lot of that right now, and not so much of the love as we used to get, 4 or 5 years ago. And that's just my thought. And those are the reasons why I'm shaping those questions in the thing. I'll leave it up to you guys.
I certainly have opinions on the how do you get people to contribute question, which I'm eager to share. And the first is that all contribution to open source is self-interested. And so you will never be able to convince somebody to make a contribution to an open source project if it's not in their interest to do so. So perhaps part of that is communicating in what way it's in their interest to do so. But I also have a significant problem with this idea of giving back. The frame of giving back to a project that you got so much from is a frame of largesse. It's a frame of philanthropy. Open source contribution is something that you do as a kind of an act of charity, rather than something that you do because it is in your interests to do it, because you have a shared interest in seeing this project develop. So I prefer the frame of shared contribution or shared development, rather than talking about giving back to an open source project personally. Either of you have additional thoughts on this topic?
I agree with you. I think that's why I tried. I'll say, Paris, I think I admit that I think the one thing that maybe I've contributed that is a genuinely new idea is the idea of calling open source a supply chain for the products. And then all of these things fall into place. You go, do you ever feel guilty again because you paid Bosch $5 and $7 for a fuel injector, but you're making $7,500 off the car? You don't ever feel guilty about that because they're still getting $2 per fuel injector, right? Like they're still making money. It's fine. I think as long as you're contributing enough to the open source project to, one, again, tackle all the supply chain security issues, resiliency, absolutely have like sway over the, supply chain, influence it. Like you're doing it in your own self-interest. There's nothing not self-interested about there, but yet it doesn't feel dirty to talk about it in that way. You're like, oh, okay, this makes sense. I see why this happens. There's other things, for example, that Red Hat does that are purely charity. Like you'll see, we'll do these videos on like open source in biology and these things that clearly will never have any impact on our business, and not unless we're like 500 times the size we are now. But it is genuinely charity. But I'd say that obviously the vast majority of our contributions are in things that where I think we contribute, but I also think we extract value. And I think it's a dirty word to say that we extract value. I've gotten into people don't like that when I use that word.
I think we have to change that. That's a dirty word, to be blunt. But I absolutely think you're right. And I think when you thinking of it as self-interest, like these are communities of practice that come together in order to get whatever it is that they want and need out of this shared resource. And the uniqueness of open source is that resource is infinite. As long as there's power in silicon, like anyone can take from it and get whatever they need from it. That's glorious and unique, I think, in the history of the world. And so there is this actual very interesting, unique property of open source, which is that it's not scarce. And so you have to treat all of those interactions not through the mindset of scarcity. When you think about like asking people to give back or requiring them to give back or valuing people on how much they contribute, that's the wrong mindset, because it assumes that if they don't contribute, that the upstream will die. And like it won't die. It's an infinite thing. Like will it be slowed down? Perhaps. Will it not grow in the way you might want? Maybe. Who knows? But in some cases, not even that's going to happen. It's actually just fine the way it is. And like the reality is that we have to frame it as this mutual cooperation, where what we're doing is stewarding this resource together because we all get benefit, whatever that benefit is out of the resource. For some people, it's that resource is a fuel injector and you're building OpenShift. For others, it's the direct thing that I'm using or consuming. Like, who knows what the benefit is? The beauty of it is you don't have to care because it's not zero sum. And that nature of it not being zero sum is the thing that opens up open source communities and culture. And the culture problem we see now is that in startups, the need for zero sum is strong because you believe you need to capture all that value so that you can have an exit that justifies the venture capital that went into what you were doing. And that mindset infects the way people look at open source, and it infects that conversation with like, well, is Amazon a bad actor? I think Amazon's a great actor in open source on the main. They produce a ton of open source. They contribute all the time. They do a bunch of stuff. They're pretty good. Microsoft, pretty great now, in comparison, especially in comparison to what they used to be. But Microsoft's killing it right now, and it's because they've come to understand the true nature of that supply chain. What I think hasn't happened culturally for FOSS is that sort of we haven't caught up to the truth of that. Like the people who advocate for free and open source software, far too few of us actually truly believe that it's better, that we all gain mutual benefit. In the end, we're actually arguing for our own benefit.
So thank you very much, Adam and Scott. We're coming up on the top of the hour. I want to thank you for this conversation. And before we sign off, I do want to acknowledge one comment in the chat from Ralph Dlugi-Hegver. Can you discuss small open source projects? So that's certainly an intention of part of this series, Rolf. Today's session was about open source product management, and as such, it was kind of naturally companies building products on open source. So it's less of a focus today, but we will have sessions where we talk about the economics of small open source projects in the future, and I hope you'll be able to join us for that. So I'd like to give a heads up to our episode 2 coming next week. We'll have Stephen O'Grady talking about convenience and open source in the era of software as a service, in the ways in which software as a service has created kind of a more convenient delivery mechanism for open source than a lot of open source projects are providing, or open source product vendors are providing. A kind of a complementary topic to what Adam touched on for MongoDB and Amazon. So I hope I'll see you all next week. And this discussion will be going up onto YouTube. It is available on demand as soon as we finish the broadcast here, so you can send people to this URL and they'll be able to watch this presentation anytime after this presentation. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Scott and Adam, for your time and expertise. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I will see you all again soon.
Thank you.